Hello, and welcome to module, I guess it's 3 in U.S. History 211. This week, we are going to spend some time looking specifically at sexuality and gender. And I don't have a PowerPoint because I want you to spend some time really interacting with this one source. The two sources. So make sure that you read chapter 3 in our Zen textbook, which is here, which is going to give us a lot of insight into, excuse me, Bacon's Rebellion of the late 17th century. And if you look closely at the date, 1676, you'll realize that Bacon's Rebellion happens 100 years before the American Revolution. And I point that out because it is going to have fundamental consequences that not only reshape colonial Virginia, but also, excuse me, the rest of colonial America. We're going to spend some time really looking at the impact of Bacon's Rebellion next week. But I just wanted to point that out to you before we go further, as you're going to want to also use some of this in the discussion. But this week, I want to really focus our attention on sexuality and gender. And when I found this document on the history of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender history in the United States, it really gave me pause to make sure that we included a discussion of this history, because when we start to pick apart different laws as well as the historical record, primary sources, looking at who is arrested, we can also start to really understand the ways that ideas of sexuality have shaped the United States. I don't want to give the impression that transgender, gay, women's history, lesbian history, bisexual history begins in the 20th century, but rather what we find is a very rich history of people who are considered sexually transgressive, or who are demonstrating behaviors or identities that seem contrary or are contrary to the legal code, which the legal code in colonial America very much dictated sexuality, gender identity, and the application and behavior of those characteristics. I find this very interesting. I hope you do too. I'm just going to sort of pinpoint some of these. Remember, in the discussion, you are choosing 5 to talk about, but make sure you keep your discussion here in the 17th century, the 1600s. So here are a few that we could look at. Again, the first colony in Jamestown is established in 1609. So by 1624, a colonial, Richard Cornish, is executed in Virginia for alleged homosexual acts with a servant. Of course, this is in violation of the colony's sodomy laws. 20 years later, in Massachusetts, so there is by this time the establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This is where Puritans or the famed Pilgrims will land, right? Elizabeth Johnson is fined and whipped for quote unquote unseemly practices with another maid, attempting to do that which men and women do. So here's an example of a woman. We don't know her age. Elizabeth Johnson, obviously a woman from England, is whipped and fined for having sexual relations with another woman. 1652, 10 years later, this time in New Hampshire, right? So it's also interesting to see how the colonies are expanding, going from just Virginia, now they're colonies in Massachusetts, a colony in New Hampshire. Another colonist, Joseph Davis of New Hampshire, is fined for, quote, putting on woman's apparel and made to admit his guilt to the community. So here we have an example of cross-dressing and Remember, laws are already on the books against this, which is also very interesting to try to unpack and think about the need for putting these types of laws on the books. 1677, 1 year after Bacon's Rebellion, is a sodomy trial of Nicholas Simpson of Connecticut, revealing that he had been open about his desire to sleep with men for more than 30 years. So, exhibiting these behaviors, getting caught, doing things that are considered sexually deviant or transgressive are met by state-sponsored punishment. In 1698, so now we have nearly, close to 100 years of British colonization in America. A French explorer among the Illinois Indian remarks on the number of women living as men in the indigenous world, and the prevalence of homosexual activity. The term "berdache" is considered an offensive term by Native Americans. It is the term that is used by the French to explain Native American sexuality, particularly the practice of lesbianism. On the other side, right? 1636, Reverend John Cotton in Massachusetts proposed including sexual relations between women in the definition of sodomy for the first time. So that's interesting. It's also interesting to consider what happened in order to have this conversation. 1649, two women, Sarah Norman and Mary Hammond of Plymouth County, are taken to court for quote-unquote lewd behavior with each other. 1662, the first edition of Michael Wigglesworth, The Day of Doom, is published, which is an epic poem considering America's first bestseller with 1,800 copies sold, which is fairly interesting. Massachusetts, 1691, Deborah Byer is fined and publicly humiliated for wearing men's clothing. And then this will certainly go on. In the 18th century, in the 1700s, Lord Cornbury, a royal governor of New York and New Jersey, is accused as dressing as a woman, of course, by his political opponents. Whether that's true or not, I do not know, but the charge is levied against him. In 1777, Thomas Jefferson revises Virginia's sodomy laws to make it punishable by mutilation rather than death, which is also interesting. Here in 1752, Dr. Charles Hamilton is arrested in Pennsylvania and revealed to be Charlotte Hamilton, who confessed to be living as a man for years. Going into this history, we're going to see a number of different things. This is always one that stands out to me. In 1850, the Crow Nation woman chief is spotted by appalled travelers in Wyoming for having several wives. So not only is she a lesbian chief, but has numerous wives as well. Obviously, this is going to be noticed by colonists in 1850s Wyoming. So we might consider then, again, I want to keep our discussion sort of in the colonial period. I know I just went past that myself. But I want you to use this document as well as what you're hearing about life in colonial America in the Zen text to really start to consider the ways that sexuality is governed by laws. How people who are subverting or doing things outside the pre-described ideas of gender are met with force and prosecuted for it. We might consider what it means that we have these examples from this colonial period. And you might even consider really what is the value of knowing this. I find great value in this. But a discussion about it is also needed. How do we incorporate space to really understand sexuality and identity both in the 21st century or in the 17th century? We certainly see the law impose a heteronormative concept forward. And we can also see how that impacts people. We can also see how people are resisting um, that identity and casting their own. But I'm really interested to see what you all have to say about this history, and how you can sort of take this to have a better understanding of sexual identity in the 21st century. So this is going to be sort of the extent of the lecture for this week. Make sure to read or review the chapter, post in the discussion, cite your sources, including this one, and complete the quiz. Next week, we will return to a in-depth discussion of Bacon's Rebellion and its broader impacts. And I'm going to break it down in a number of ways, as this is really seen as a seminal moment in colonial history. Please let me know if you have any questions this week, and I very much look forward to reading your posts and the discussions.